Yeah, Kevin, I have cough medicine. Do you want some?
Yes, please.
Or is that what Isaac got?
I don't know why Isaac told me to give him medicine if you're going to.
Okay, we're good to go.
No, I'm not gonna give him NyQuil. I'll give him NyQuil for the night. I already had it out. I have DayQuil too.
Yeah, you packed them in.
I know, because I have 4.
What else you got, man?
Unfortunately.
And on that note,
Pulls out an oxy.
we are on camera, so it's not in the ceiling, it's in the camera. It's not Big Brother.
We're all to eat these donuts, even though they've been sitting here since moving.
I definitely ate one. So I got bored waiting for everyone, so I ate a stale donut.
How stale is it?
They're not as crunchy as I thought they were going to be.
Crunchy dope. Wait.
Okay, we're gonna start. Alright, so we are obviously here to talk about answering framework in the 2AC. And basically what I have here is a sort of general checklist for when you're for block writing of sort of pieces that I think you should always have ready before going into a framework debate, and then 2 sort of general strategies for the 2AC against framework depending on what kind of affirmative you are reading. And I have some examples of from my AF work last year that kind of represent the 2 general different ways of doing this that we can go through. So to start with the checklist, obviously the first thing, just like in a topicality debate, is probably some kind of we-meet. Now, to be completely honest, most of the time this will never leave the 2AC, but it is still good to have it in there, especially because framework teams have a tendency to make their interpretation like really broad so that they can link to 2AC offense. So it's strategic to sort of try to spin your way into a we-meet, so at the very least you have it as a defensive argument later in the debate. The second more important argument is your counter-interpretation. Now the counter-interpretation will change depending on the affirmative that you read, and your counter-interpretation should be somewhat grounded in the literature of the affirmative you're reading, just like if this was a policy F on topicality, but of course that this will look a little bit different because essentially what your counter-interpretation is that you are taking a sort of argument for why the affirmative is about the resolution or in the direction of the resolution, and then sort of working backwards to say that this is a broad way that we should interpret the topic in order to allow multiple approaches to the topic. The third sort of piece of this checklist is affirmative offense. And regardless of which of the strategies you're using, 2AC offense is the most important part of the 2AC to framework. And what I mean by offense is arguments that are both disads to the negative interpretation and net benefits to your counter-interpretation. And you should probably have 2 to 3 arguments in the 2AC that you can label as independent disads to the negative interpretation. And this is strategic both in the sense that it's good to have a breadth of offense to the interpretation, but also that it's sort of will be helpful to you to actually label these as disads and give them a sort of concise name that can be referred to, because that will make it easier for the judge to sort of deal with them and follow them in the debate. Yeah.
So we can pick any 2 to 3 names we want.
Yeah. What you name your offense isn't as important as just the fact that you have a sort of name that you use to refer to that piece of offense throughout the debate, because it'll make it easier for judges to evaluate. And especially if you have a judge that's sort of on the fence about whether or not they're like a K judge or a policy judge, it's more likely that they will vote in your favor if they can really grasp sort of what the offense against framework is. So the next 3 or sort of last 3 pieces on this checklist is the sort of 3 general categories of affirmative offense that you should be prepared to answer. Now, affirmatives may call these different things and may have a variety of combinations of offense, but in 99% of cases, the offense will boil down to one of three arguments. One, a fairness disad to the AF, which is often coupled with an argument about debate being a game. The second is that education about the topic is good. And the third is that an argument about deliberation or democracy or agonism or whatever it's called. But essentially the argument is that the affirmative has prevented a sort of clashed discussion from happening in the debate. And the terminal impact of that could be anything from advocacy skills to like the strength of democracy is key to check extinction. Like it could be anything from like one pole to the other, but the internal link will boil down to deliberation. So the sort of responses to these three in your 2AC could either be purely defensive arguments or sort of impact turn style responses, or just using the affirmative as offense, depending on the strengths of your particular affirmative. But the important thing is to make sure that all three components of the framework argument are covered. A couple other things that are sort of embedded